and I'm a public health professional, a mother of 4, and I'm really excited about the discussion. Nadine, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nadine Hansen, and I live in Cedar City, and I'm an attorney. Also married, mother of 4, but mine are all grown up.
All right, Lori, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Lori Winder, and I live in Los Angeles, California, and I'm a lifelong Mormon feminist.
Great. Nancy?
I'm Nancy Ross, and I do social media, run social media for Ordain Women, and I'm an art history professor here at Dixie State University in St. George, Utah.
Great. And Christy?
And a mom of 2 kids and a wife.
Great. Okay, Christy?
Sure. I'm Christy Money, and I'm a psychologist and lifelong church member and endowed, and I'm also a mother of 2 girls, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. All right, we're going to go ahead and start with our discussion. The last discussion 1, they discussed patriarchy. And so just before we move on to today's topic, does anyone have any other final thoughts to mention about patriarchy? One thing that I thought of as we were doing our discussion, that I wasn't actually on the live version, but one thing that I thought of when we talked about patriarchy is that my brothers, as soon as they were 12 years old, they stopped having female leaders at church. There were no more female leaders for them. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was a sign of patriarchy that I noticed. Has anyone else noticed any signs that they'd like to mention?
I think I'm ready to delve into discussion too.
All right.
Fair enough.
Everybody get a chance to watch the video?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. All right. What did you find most surprising or interesting in the video presentation?
Well, for me, I was struck by the progression from the late 1800s all the way to 1946, when there was finally that letter saying that women weren't supposed to give blessings anymore. Like it seemed like to me like a gradual chipping away of authority, and it made me really sad.
Yeah, I noticed that too. As I was going over the history, that authority just seemed to shrink over time.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's a little ironic that we in 2014 look back to the 19th century for powerful women role models, and I think even Laurel Ulrich has noted that after, I would say, probably the mid 20th century, basically we keep hearkening back to older times to find powerful women role models in the church, and I think that is it's really problematic for women who have grown up in the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century.
I think for myself that as a young woman, I really had no female leaders like on a big church scale that I really identified with or knew about or felt moved by. I mean, I have a few now, but growing up, it was only male leaders that I was supposed to look up to.
Right. One thing about the video that I would like to mention is somebody mentioned last week that they watched the video and they were under the impression that the video was saying that because of malice, male leaders took things away from women over time, and I actually did not think that. Mm-hmm. I didn't think that was what was going on. What I thought was going on is that because women didn't have the priesthood and they had a lower status than men, they weren't involved in those decisions about what their authority should be and what their responsibility should be. And right. So even though they had a lot of responsibilities at different times, and sometimes they even had a lot of authority, they never had the choice about what should women do in this church. The choice always belonged to the men. And so decisions would happen without female input or with female input, but in spite of their objections. And that's just because they did not have the priesthood, so they were not the decision makers.
Well, there was also a relative autonomy, for the Relief Society before the priesthood correlation program was fully instituted. I would say it started early in the 20th century, but pretty much the last half of the 20th century, particularly the last quarter of the 20th century. And so female initiative, if you will, became lessened, and more and more programs were overseen by male priesthood authorities.
And I think a big thing there for me in studying the history of the church too is that one of the really women's voices were taken away with the loss of women's own publications.
Right.
And instead, those women's publications were taken over by priesthood leaders, and then priesthood leaders put a lot more male voices in women's church publications, and so that really kind of feel like without our publications, we kind of lost our voice.
Well, it's certainly true of, I think that's definitely true, Nancy, and then it's certainly true of our manuals. They're almost overwhelmingly quotes from male priesthood leaders. Not that male priesthood leaders don't have, substantial and important things to say, but women do as well. But it's the loss of voice that's important.
Right. Nadine, did you have any comments? We haven't heard from you yet.
Well, I was just thinking about what happened. Like, it was about 1970 when they sort of more fully implemented correlation. It might have been 72. I don't remember exactly. But the thing that I think they were trying to do was to give some more responsibility to men, and to get them to step up and fill some important church roles. And for whatever reasons, they thought they needed to do that. And what happened was, it happened at the expense of women, but I don't know that they intended it to be that way. I just think there wasn't women's input into what happened, and women's sort of marginalization since then happened as a byproduct. But I agree, I don't necessarily think it was malice, as somebody said earlier. It was just that they felt that they needed to incorporate men more into the leadership roles, which kind of meant pushing women to the side, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. One thing I think about is, with correlation, they also introduced the council system, which was designed in a certain way to include women. Unfortunately, they also designed it so that women would always be outnumbered and outranked in those councils. But they did incorporate women, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate that because of the lower status of women, we will always be outnumbered and outranked on those councils. I think that it's not necessarily in this day and age important that we have separate men's organizations and women's organizations doing things the way they did at the 19th century when women were more empowered. I would like to see us work together more, but I would like to see us work together as equals.
Yeah, me too.
Christy, did you have any additional comments?
I had a question for you, April, about your the quote that Patty Sessions said in 1884. Her name sounds really familiar. That she. Can you tell me more about her and her role in giving blessings and anointings? Because that was a really fascinating quote.
Yes. Patty Sessions was a midwife, and she was there right at the beginning of the church. Actually, after Brigham Young disbanded the Relief Society, Patty Sessions and Eliza R. Snow worked together to keep Relief Society going a little bit longer. So they kind of secretly held Relief Society meetings and kept things going for a while. When they got to the Salt Lake Valley, Patty Sessions, as a midwife, as part of her profession, she was also ordained to give blessings so that she could fully help the people that she was serving as a midwife. So not only did she administer to them physically, but also spiritually.
Wow. Well, thanks, April.
Okay, so how has studying LDS women's history expanded your vision of women's spiritual and administrative potential?
When I was the age of a few younger women, we didn't really ever know anything about this history of Mormon women and the spiritual blessings and things that they gave, even the way even not that much about the organization of the Relief Society. And then they started Exponent 2, but we didn't have the internet, so I didn't. Eventually, I found out about it, but being a Mormon feminist in California, I thought I was the only one in the church. And so, but the other thing that brought that information to me was Carolyn Pearson wrote a couple of books. She wrote The Flight and the Nest and Daughters of Light. And that was really my first introduction to the idea that women had exercised spiritual gifts in the early LDS Church, the early part of the Restoration. And it was really kind of mind-blowing to me to know that our forebears had done that, and then it had just all been taken away, and to the point where we didn't even know about it.
Right.
Well, the group of women in Boston did a sort of precursor to Exponent 2 was an institute class that they put together where they each did individual, this was in the early 70s, where they each did individual papers. They each took a topic and researched them, and that became the book that was edited by Claudia Bushman. It's Mormon Sisters, right?
Mormon Sisters, yeah.
And it was a pivotal book. I mean, here was one of the first sort of modern books of Mormon women's history. After that, we had Sisters in Spirit that came out, another series of essays, and then Leonard Arrington, as church historian, was very progressive in terms of making sure that Mormon history included women's history. So,
right.
But Nadine's right. We had no sense of these stories unless we had, hints and guesses of them in our own family histories.
Yeah.
So my mom was involved with the Boston feminists for a little bit, and growing up, I think my mom was afraid of shattering my very strong, very orthodox testimony and telling me some of the things that she had learned through her participation through Boston Feminists. And so I never really understood any of this until I encountered feminist Mormon housewives maybe in 2007, in 2008. And so, I'm an educated person, but I still didn't really know anything about my own religious history in terms of what women did in the past. And I think, to me, it feels today like a tremendous loss. I mean, it's not something I had. I've never been a part of a Relief Society that had power and authority and independence. But I feel this tremendous loss, like looking at this timeline, and I've seen other timelines, and yes, sweetheart. And I feel lost. I feel like, I lost something I never really had, and part of me just desperately wants to get it back.
Well, and back to your idea of women's publications, Nancy. One of the things that prompted a lot of the research that was done by the Boston women was that one of them found the original Woman's Exponent, which was a publication that began in the 1870s. And ended publication in the early, the second decade of the 20th century. But it was a major suffragist periodical. It had Relief Society news and that sort of thing, but it was a major vehicle for women's suffrage.
Right.
And a lot of the articles speak very strong language about women's rights, and above and beyond the right to vote.
And I know that at that period, and periodicals like the Exponent, that their line on women's issues was very much in line with radical feminist thinking at the time, and that and that. So again, that seems like we've come really to a very different place and are talking about women. I also know that those early periodicals used to kind of spotlight women and different kinds of women. And they were also very careful to showcase a variety of women doing a variety of different kinds of jobs in addition to being wives and mothers. And I feel like if there's something that I would love to see in our church periodicals, it would be a showcasing of a variety of women doing a variety of different kinds of things, because I've always felt that as a woman who works, I really have no mirror in church publications of someone who does that or did that, and that people like me our stories are excluded because we're perhaps not kosher enough. And so I know that those early publications did that, and part of me just really longs for that kind of inspiration in church women.
And I think that I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that I think that there is some efforts now to give women more visibility, and I applaud those efforts. The Mormon Women's Project highlights the stories of a variety of women who are doing whose lives aren't cookie cutter.
Right.
So I applaud efforts like that. Go ahead.
I do too.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say is that I discovered kind of inadvertently when a significant change took place, and in the Relief Society magazine. And my daughter was there when they were cleaning out old books and magazines from a ward library, and they had several bound, a whole year bound of Relief Society magazines, and so she picked up a couple of the one-year collections from the 1940s, and then a couple of them from the 1950s, just to kind of get a flavor of those different eras. And in the 1940s ones, this was like during World War II. When women were Rosie the Riveter, both my mother and my grandmother were Rosie the Riveters, and in those magazines, they had just what you said, Nancy. They had articles about women in a variety of roles, and not just in America. I remember I was seeing something about a woman who was a national leader in another country. I don't remember where it was, and that continued through those 1940s during that war period time. And then after the war, just as in the larger society in America, the women needed to vacate the workplace because the men were coming home. They needed the jobs. They wanted to start families. They had delayed that while their husbands were off at war. And so there was a great amount of support for women to leave the workplace, move into the domestic sphere. And they did that, and the magazine reflects that. But at that time, that was very much in keeping with what was going on in the larger society.
Right.
But then we kind of got stuck in the 1950s, and I think we're just getting out of them now.
That is actually a great transition into the next question we were going to discuss, which is what factors have influenced the changes in the roles of women in our church over time. And I think that's a good point, that big cultural shift in the 1950s with women being encouraged to come home and make room for the soldiers coming home to have all the jobs seems to have had a big impact on our culture and our church.
Right. And so I think larger cultural factors in America had a huge impact on, church. And that's not like revelation. That is cultural context.
Right. Sonia Farnsworth, who studies rhetoric basically, but has written some wonderful articles that we've all appreciated. One in particular on the motherhood priesthood, a whole sort of study of the motherhood priesthood idea parallel. But she has opined that when the church abandoned polygamy in the late 19th century and entered the 20th century, it embraced Victorian values, just as well, at least in the United States, as the United States was moving out of the Victorian era. But that's sort of the era that it embraced. It embraced Victorian values in terms of social, the woman in the home, and the conservative economic values, and just as the United States was entering the progressive era, it came out in reaction to polygamy. It sort of embraced values that were the earlier values that were probably less progressive. So
separate spheres.
Yeah, the separate spheres was certainly part of it in terms of women, but it happened, and so I think that I've always found that sort of an interesting thing, that we sort of embraced Victorian values with a vengeance after we had come out of a period where we were seen as, I don't know, depending how you look at polygamy, I guess, progressive or regressive, but we were communitarian. And we left our communitarian roots behind, and we embraced a rabid capitalism, and you can help me out on some of these things. I mean, if you've read any of her material, but to me that was sort of an interesting thing to think about.
In the sociology of religion, there is this clear pattern with new Christian traditions that emerge. That initially, new Christian traditions revel in their uniqueness, and at that stage in development, women often are drawn to new religions, and so they end up having a lot of power and a lot of authority in a new religion. And then after that initial period of uniqueness and newness, religions try to become more like everybody else. And so it's often in that process where women, where a religious group has grown and they now have men, and so men take over those positions. And as that kind of normalization process happens, women lose the kind of power that they had formerly, and our church is really no different. We have followed that pattern very clearly. I think that's what you're really describing, Lori, is this, we had this earlier, in the 19th century, where we were unique and new and doing all of these different things, like polygamy and communitarianism. Not that I want to go back to polygamy, but we were doing all these unusual things. And then in the 20th century, we tried to blend in and be like every American, more like your Protestant neighbors down the road. And and we can see that. I mean, that is kind of a sociological pattern, and we follow that pattern.
Right. Well, and also what comes with it in religious movements, it made me think also, Nancy, of the fact that there's a tendency when you're a small group, you have charismatic elements in the organization, and in a smaller group where power is less formalized, women certainly can participate in those, in have a certain amount of charismatic power. But as you get larger, power gets routinized, and women often lose power in that situation as well, particularly when that routinization includes power being priesthood power, and that positional power, when positional power requires priesthood and women are not ordained, then women basically, while there might be some women who are quite charismatic and on a local level have influence because of their spirituality, their charisma, their whatever else. As we move up the leadership, to the broader church, women lose power. That charismatic power doesn't carry over into as you move away from the local level.
Right.
And also, I think the film also points out, in the early church, even in early Christianity, what scholars who are looking at first century Christianity are discovering is that women had a great deal of power in the first century Christian churches, because the churches were in the domestic sphere. They were small and they met in people's homes, and women had a lot of power in the domestic sphere. Right. That doesn't just mean cleaning the house and stuff like that. Sometimes we're talking about very powerful women who controlled estates. And also, Paul, there were several women who funded Paul's missionary activities. They were patronesses for Paul's work. But what they're finding is, as the Christianity grew and moved into the public sphere, the public sphere traditionally had been the male sphere, and women lost power.
All right, let's go over some of the readings that we had for this. First of all, let's talk about Sister Okazaki. What does Sister Okazaki's interview about the roles of the highest-ranking women in the church tell us? So she was one of the highest-ranking women in the church. She was the first counselor in the General Relief Society presidency. And based on her interview, what were the limitations to her role, even though she was quite high-ranking compared to other women?
Well, first of all, they rarely met with the first presidency, for example, and that was pretty shocking to me because I think we may at least I used to make assumptions that they met very regularly with male priesthood leaders with the first presidency, and but that just wasn't the case. I think we learned that. And also, all of their decisions were clearly subject to male priesthood authority.
For me, in reading that interview, I read this interview first about a year ago, and it was just this big disaster for me, kind of personally, to see that our women leaders really have very little power and authority, that they have influence over very few things. And I think it's near the end of the interview where Sister Okazaki says that, we really need stronger women to break through, but she's not sure that she has the confidence in Mormon women. We just don't cultivate those kinds of strong, charismatic leadership abilities in women to be able to kind of break through at the highest levels, and for our female leaders to insist on participation, which I thought was very sad.
Yeah.
Well, for instance, the proclamation on the family came out during the Relief Society presidency of Elaine Jack, Aline Clyde, and Chieko Okazaki. And they did not know anything about it until it was, well, like just right before it was released. It was released originally in a Relief Society annual meeting. That was where it was first read. But they had no input on it. Here we've got this document that is so popular and defines women's roles, and yet the female leadership of the church never had one clue that it was even coming out until right when it was already finalized.
And Sister Okazaki says very clearly in her interview with Greg Prince that, she would have liked to have made some changes.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I would have liked her to have made some changes.
Me too.
And I think that's a really challenging thing. I mean, the interview is very hard-hitting in many ways, and and I kind of look up to Sister Okazaki for being kind of a champion of women. But even in her very lofty church position, it seems like there was very little that she could really affect with regards to women.
I think she affected women a lot.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
She was very charismatic and very good at what she did, and such a wonderful role model and an open person, a person who is open to women in their various roles.
Absolutely.
And their various things in life.
I think I was referring more to like church structure, that she wasn't able to affect structural change to make sure that women's voices were included and heard in a larger sense, not just by her and not just by the sisters she served with, but by the priesthood leaders above her.
I heard Aline Clyde speak at Claremont a few years ago, where she described the meeting where they were told, well, they went to meet with the First Presidency, one of the rare times they met with them, and they had been planning for months the Relief Society meeting that around. They had tried very hard to have a message of inclusiveness, in the way she described it. They were going to talk about various types of families and various types of women, and how we're all sisters, and we all have to make decisions about our lives, individually, but we can come together united in love and in Christ. Even though our situations may vary, even though our family situations may vary. And it was at that meeting, though, that they were pretty much told that, they appreciated all the work that they had done putting together this meeting, that they thought that they would announce the proclamation on the family at the meeting, and so they had to basically completely shift gears on a meeting that they had been planning for months. So it was difficult listening to that.
Yeah.
There actually, by the way, in terms of the proclamation, I also attended a funeral for a woman named Claire Johnson, who lived in our area, a very, on a local level, very charismatic and powerful woman, who was. There were 3 women, apparently. What was a little surprising about Elder Packer, Boyd K. Packer, was one of the speakers at the funeral, and he talked about the fact that there were 3 women who were actually consulted on the in preparing the proclamation on the family. Unfortunately, it wasn't the general presidency of the Relief Society at the time. It was I think Lucille Tate, whom I think was Elder Packer's biographer, okay. And it was Beverly Campbell, who was the church's sort of lead female spokesperson against the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was Claire Johnson who was in my state.
So instead of consulting with the Relief Society presidency, they consulted with these other women. They kind of didn't run around them.
Well, I guess it seemed. It was odd enough to me that I'd sort of popped in my mind. Well, did they consult the? At that time, I hadn't heard the story of how the proclamation, how they, had decided to completely change the meeting. And when I saw Chieko and Aline, a few months later, I asked them. I said, "That's very interesting. So, why were these women consulted, and were you consulted?" And they said they were not. And when I said, "Well, why did that occur?" I just got a look from Chieko Okazaki, like, "I don't know." A sort of look. She gave me sort of a look of resolution.
One thing I noticed, Lori, I like the way that you're using the word consultant, because as I read what Chieko Okazaki wrote, and also as I've read other things about female leaders in our church, it just reminds me they really are consultants. I mean, when we say that the Relief Society is auxiliary to the priesthood, or in other words, outside the priesthood, secondary to the priesthood, it really is. And the only opportunities for women to participate in those decisions is when men bring them in as consultants and choose to ask them. So if a man doesn't realize that he needs female input, it just doesn't happen because they're not already at the table.
And there seems to be no requirement for them, no hard and fast requirement for them to be at the table.
Right.
Let's talk about the Nauvoo Relief Society minutes. What do they tell us about Joseph Smith's vision for women in this church? And do you think we fulfilled this vision?
Well, if I can ask a question that I had from the readings, what can someone tell me more about the word change from a key being turned? I mean, because keys and scripture study about keys is really important to me right now as we talk about what existed in the Nauvoo Relief Society versus what we have now, and keys seem really important. So, Lori or April, do you know about that?
Well, April certainly does. Maybe you should answer the question, but the wording change, when we grew up, the wording had been changed from Joseph Smith, I turn the key to you, to I turn the key in your behalf.
So yes, in our early church history, looked at the Nauvoo Relief Society minutes, the exact same minutes that we read for this discussion, and for some reason, when they recorded it in the history book, they made some changes. And one of those changes is that they made that wording change. And what I noticed about that is, you know, we do talk about keys almost universally about going to men. Men have keys. And it seems like they weren't comfortable with that in the Nauvoo Relief Society minutes, how they gave keys to women. And so they kind of reworded it so it sounded more like Joseph Smith had the keys and the women were there.
Sorry, my phone is ringing.
Okay. So April, who did that?
That was done in, let me go back to that in the video. That was done.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was in the video too. Thank you for putting that in.
Yes, it was in the video. I'll have to look it up later because it was very early on though. Let's see.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was early.
Wow.
Going back to your original question, April, when you asked, you know, have we realized Joseph Smith's vision for the Relief Society? You know, if we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests and have keys of the priesthood, then I would say no.
Right.
You know, I mean, I think that's, you know.
Yeah, the documents certainly suggest that Joseph Smith intended some kind of power for women. What that is, and we just don't know. That's why I think you saw us hesitate, because we don't really know. It was never really completed, and so we have really no idea. We have hints and guesses as to what was meant, but certainly in a church where we define priesthood in terms of power, blessings, keys, and office. And authority, I think those are the like 5 words that are, was that 5? Words that have been emerging recently in sort of a discussion about women in priesthood. Keys and office seem to be placed in that sort of, in sort of the male sphere. And increasingly what they're talking about, the blessings, the power, and now, of course, with Elder Oak's talk, the authority of the priesthood, that somehow women enjoy the blessings and exercise the power and authority of the priesthood. But I think that it's also a little confusing too, because the word ordination is used, as been referred to earlier, in terms of Patty Sessions. She was ordained to give blessings. Emma was ordained.
Right, and the Nauvoo Relief Society minutes mention women as being ordained.
They do. What we mean by that may be something in the different in the church now than we meant back then. I don't. As everything in the church, the whole idea of priesthood and power and authority and what women have and what men have, it's all evolved over the years.
I don't think it's as different, though, as they try and teach that it is. Like in seminary, when we read about, it's in the Doctrine and Covenants, it says Emma Smith was ordained. Right. And when we read about that, they say, oh, that was just like being set apart. It's not the same thing. But when you read the Nauvoo Society minutes, Joseph Smith says when Emma Smith was elected by her peers to be the president of the Relief Society, he says she has already been ordained, so we don't need to ordain her. Let's give her a blessing, which to me sounds a lot more like being set apart. And then he does ordain her counselors because they had not been ordained previously. So it didn't sound like it was completely different from ordination today in that way. And not as different as sometimes we like to explain it away as being different.
Right,
well, and I think
there's certainly women and men who have done extensive research on this, who fully believe that women were ordained, in the sense were ordained to the priesthood. Although whether that means to priesthood office or not is a question.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we don't doubt that when Joseph Smith and church records say that men were ordained, that they were in fact ordained. You know, like
right.
that is not something we don't generally see ordained meaning one thing and then another thing when it comes to gender. Ordained is ordained
Right.
to me.
Yeah.
And I know that, as Lori was saying, that if you look at people who've studied the history of ordination throughout the history of the Christian Church, that often when certain words are applied to men, nobody doubts their ordination, but when those same words are applied to women, that we brush it off and say, well, those words in those contexts must have different meanings, and that's what we have in our in our King James Version translation of the New Testament. Is we have exactly that thing where there are women who are described as deaconesses or as deacons, and they translate that word as being servant or as being something else for women, but not for men. Men get the full meaning, but women get kind of a watered down meaning. And so I hate this idea that when we look at our own history, that we water down the meanings of words that have fairly obvious meanings to all of us, and maybe there were some differences, but we don't doubt in church history that when it says a man was ordained, that he was ordained, and that really bothers me.
Right.
Let me just read this. This is in the materials, because for those who might be listening who haven't read it, here's a quote. He, and that's Joseph Smith, he asked the society if they could not see by this sweeping stroke that wherein they are ordained, it is the privilege of those set apart to administer in that authority which is conferred on them. And if the sisters should have the faith to heal the sick, let all hold their tongues, and let everything roll on.
Yeah.
Now,
So
if we said that about a man, we
Right.
would certainly think of it as real ordination.
Right. And they certainly felt like they certainly perceived it as being endowed with power and authority.
Right.
Right, they did. No question. And they exercised that power and authority.
Yes, they did.
I really liked what Nancy was saying also, because I've noticed right now we're studying the Old Testament in church, and I know that we do that. We change the meetings if the person happens to be a woman. Like we studied Deborah. She was a judge in Israel. She was a prophet. Well, we know what those are. Those are priesthood callings.
Right, and those are really specific meanings for us. I mean, I realize today is a different context, but when we think of the Old Testament and prophet, I know what that means.
Yeah, but when we
Unambiguous.
about a woman having those titles, we reference scriptures that say, oh, you can prophesy without having the priesthood. It's a spiritual gift. Why don't we do that with men? Do you read about Old Testament prophets and then say, oh, well, it says he was a prophet. That probably doesn't mean he was a leader of the church, because, you can just have that as a spiritual gift. We don't do that with
Right,
men.
and probably doesn't have the priesthood. We never say that because we believe that those things are part and parcel, that those go together. And I find that to be very frustrating, that that we overly gender these terms that we know the meaning. Like, I know what the word prophet means. I know, and somehow when we apply it to a woman, it means something different.
Does anyone else have any more comments on any of the readings before we move on? No? Okay, let's look at some of these final questions. How do you feel about women's participation in church ministry and administration today? So we talked about where we were. Where are we now?
Well, I think we're kind of in a place of transition, where women are being asked to assume broader roles, and certainly with the young women being called to be missionaries at age 19 instead of at age 21, and then being given leadership roles in the mission field, and even being asked, from what I'm hearing and reading, being asked to have leadership roles in training other missionaries, and not just other female missionaries. And so I think that we are in a time when women are being asked to assume greater roles within church leadership. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there.
No, I think the church is struggling to try and give women more visibility. I mean, I know for a long time there were actually there was actually a discussion. I mean, I could actually quote that they I think both Brother Nelson and first Sister Smith, who is General Relief Society president, said women don't care so much about visibility. It's as opposed to they care more about charity than visibility. I'm not sure I got that exactly right, but it was they value the widow's might more than power, charity more than visibility, I think, or it may have been paired with anyway. But there is a sense early on that we're transitioning out of that where women were seen as I don't know how to quite say that, but it seems that we are there is a definite effort in the church now to give women more visibility, to try and include them on councils, at least on the ward level. Mm-hmm. And respond, I think it's as a response to the calls of women to have more voice in the church.
And I think that it's a real process of wrestling. I think that's what we're seeing. That's what I feel like I'm seeing playing out, because it's not going to be a clear linear path, and there are a lot of different people who have a lot of different ideas about what that increased visibility might mean. Does that mean we have simply more visibility, but do we grant women a real seat at the table, or not? And I think that's problem. Like we have, recently photos of the female auxiliary leaders were, placed in the conference center with male leaders, and that's great, but that is very much a veneer. That is a surface thing. That's something that is for show. That doesn't mean they have more power or authority or influence. It's just a visual acknowledgement.
Right. Visibility, I like visibility, but it's not enough. Visibility isn't enough.
Right.
A couple of things that I've seen recently, just on the internet, is people reporting about when they've had apostles or even area authority 70s come and do training sessions in the local areas. People are reporting back that local leaders are being trained to include women more, and being told that it's really important to include women. And so they're not making a public announcement of this, but it's happening. It's happening in the local leadership councils, apparently. I can think of at least 2 or 3 places where people have said they've been in those meetings, and this is what they're being told. You need to include the women. The women need to have a place at the table. It's really important to hear what the women have to say. So I think that is changing, but it's kind of still going on where it's not very visible to the average church member.
And it's what we said before, and what April punctuated, and that's the fact that it's always at the discretion of male priesthood leaders, and so it's almost like leader roulette. If you get a local leadership, or even on the stake level, leadership that's wants to be responsive to the needs of their members, then particularly in terms of women's issues, then there are many ways women can be incorporated into the decision making. The problem is it's always at the discretion of male leaders, and I think that's one reason why those of us who have been calling for women's ordination for years and years and years believe that that just giving women visibility and inviting them to the table is insufficient. That in order to, they have to by priesthood, by right, within the structure of the organization, have a right at the table.
And a right in the decision making, the ultimate decision making, not just as a counseling.
Well, and both Lori and Nadine, it seems like we're kind of talking about a couple of different levels of maybe progression that we'll see in the future, which is right now women are getting more perhaps visibility, and perhaps the conference center photos are an example of that. And maybe, with the instructions that some local leaders are getting that they need to include women on councils, that would allow for women to have a certain degree of voice. But it's going to be another level yet, as Nadine says, before women are allowed to make decisions. And it seems, for us anyway, with ordained women, I think many of us feel like women will never be able to make decisions until they have that priesthood power. And so, maybe it'll take a long time for us to work through these different levels before women, visibility and voice and decision making. And, I'm sure that we all hope very much to live to see women reach the decision making level.
But the point is the very structure, the male priesthood structure of the church, somewhat undermines or makes it more difficult for women to have voice and decision-making authority and that sort of thing. So that's why a number of us have looked at the structure as well as the the structural issue.
Since Nadine mentioned this, I just have to point this out, but I have also had friends who've told me that in their local areas they've had general authorities come and they've had big meetings where they've talked about women's issues and what to do to make women more visible in the church, to include women more in these different decision-making opportunities, not as equals, but to counsel with women more as consultants. And that I've noticed about this is that the people who describe these meetings describe men-only meetings.
Yeah.
That they have very important male-only meetings where a bunch of men get together and talk about how to better include women in our church governance.
And that makes
quite ironic.
And that makes me feel like women have no right of their own to be included, but that we have to be invited, and somebody has to be willing to let women be present. And that's a lot of gatekeeping.
Right.
That's a lot. And in some ways, I feel like that's a lot of talking about wanting to include women more, but sometimes it's a little bit for show unless we actually follow through and have accountability to let that happen.
Right. Okay, so looking at some of these other questions, we've talked a little bit about what women's participation is like in the church today, and I think we've also talked about a lot of the barriers that are preventing us from fully participating in the church. So could women's ordination address these barriers? Why or why not? Hi, Lori. Welcome back. We were just talking about how a women's ordination might address some of these barriers that we've discussed that prevent women from fully participating in the church.
Well, yeah. Basically, as I suggested before, positional power in the church, which means decision-making power in the church for the most part, is dependent on priesthood ordination, on priesthood office, and while that's the case, women will be left out of the major decision-making bodies of the church. And again, only consulted, and as I wouldn't say as an afterthought, but at the discretion of, rather than having a like I said, an actual place at the table.
Right. Another question that we have here is, are there other intermediary steps we could take to improve the status of women in our church?
Oh,
Numerous.
Absolutely. That list so long. even if you just take the whole ordination issue off the table, there are so many things that we could do to improve the status of women. From budget issues to recommend and counseling issues. There are a lot of issues.
Well, one of the things that I've said for decades now is that really there are not that many church positions that you have to have priesthood to do. But they always choose a priesthood holder to do them. And I think that if they could call women to do some of these jobs, they don't have to be priesthood callings, but it would make a huge difference to just have women have all all church callings open to women that don't actually require priesthood. That is, that don't require you to be like setting people apart with or
like
performing priesthood ordinances.
I have a list of probably 30 right here in my hand. They're listed at on the All Are Alike Unto God website, and we're not the only one.
Give us the web address, Lori.
Oh, it's if they just Google all Are Alike Unto God, it will pop up. But I mean, there are any number of things. Encourage partnership in marriage and eliminate the idea that husbands preside over their wives. That's there. Create parity in the young men and young women's programs. Balance the stories and images of boys and men in the church in church publications. Invite women to church leadership positions to speak and pray during general conference in numbers equal to the number of men. Encourage leaders to use gender-inclusive language. Instruct bishops to refrain from asking church members probing questions about sexual practices and experiences. Call women to perform pastoral counseling, particularly for women and girls who have been sexually abused. Choose a generally study presidency and general board that reflect the diversity of viewpoint and circumstances in the church. Actually, that's beginning to happen. And I'm really happy about that with expanding the general board. Yes. Include the Stake Relief Society president in stake presidency meetings. Include the Relief Society president in bishopric meetings. Mm-hmm. As Nadine said, examine every position in the church to see, to determine whether or not it actually requires priesthood to function.
Positions and policies too.
Exactly.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Exactly.
Like, in the church handbook, policies
include
like
women.
A sister missionary being able to baptize, or to be a witness at the baptism.
To be a witness, exactly. Mm-hmm. And at marriages, why can't a woman witness a marriage? A
woman can sign as a witness on the legally binding document marriage certificate, but is not allowed to be a witness at a Mormon wedding.
Should I go on? Appoint women as presidents of church universities and heads of administrative departments.
They did consider a president for a woman of a church.
Yeah, university. I know. I thought that was. I noted that. That was great.
Yeah. BYU, my alma mater.
Lift the prohibition on women participating in the blessing of their children.
Which just seems so unnecessarily harsh that you can't hold the baby.
Exactly.
Lori, my Protestant aunt went to a baby blessing and told me afterward, where was the mother? It was just really foreign to her to not have the mother there for this naming blessing of the baby.
And getting back to our, our historical discussion, restore the former institutionally accepted practice of women giving blessings of healing and comfort. Mm-hmm. And we have a precedent for that.
Yeah, and I've had so many friends who have wished that they could do that and want that back.
Right.
And I see no greater, family bonding and strengthening activity than a husband and a wife blessing their children together. There just is nothing that sounds scandalous about that to me in terms of strengthening a family and strengthening a marriage and using the power of God together to bless your family.
And you know what, Nancy? Joseph Fielding Smith, who on your timeline shows that he's the one that made the announcement that women couldn't do blessings anymore. But there used to be a column in the Improvement era way back when called Answers to Gospel Questions, and he said in one of those answers, he said, it is no uncommon thing for a husband and wife to jointly administer to their children, and with the husband being the mouth, and saying by the authority of the priesthood in us vested. That's my recollection of the language that he used.
Well, and also given President Oak's talk in the priesthood session, this last priesthood session, You know, he explicitly said that women in their callings are endowed with authority of the priesthood, that they it's a reflective authority because they work under the office and keys of the leaders of their congregations or the church, or you know, whichever level they function. But I thought that was pretty interesting, and so I mean, could we as women then in our callings say, by virtue of the authority of the priesthood that by the authority of the priesthood that I hold by virtue of my calling in the church, and then, you know, could we start saying that?
Well, and that's tricky. I know that women in the past, that when they gave blessings, that they invoked the name of Jesus Christ. And either way, I think it would be like a wonderful, it would be offering women spiritual and ritual power in a way that is really, I think, transformational. I've received many blessings in my life. I've never given one. I would love the opportunity to give one or to participate in giving one. And when people talk about, oh, well, women can experience all the blessings of the priesthood, we can't really experience any of the blessings or the learning that happens from exercising the priesthood. And I imagine that that has got to be a powerful, moving thing, to be able to, you know, to invoke the power of God to bless the life of someone else in a very direct verbal way.
Well, and you know, following that up, could the Relief Society president, how powerful would that be if the Relief Society presidents were able to give blessings to, by the authority that they hold in that calling, to minister to the women in their congregation? How powerful would that be?
It would be tremendously powerful. You know, I think that's. And I think that when people think about women wanting the priesthood, they think about power-hungry women, women who want to be bishops, like me, mine, now, you know, that kind of thing. But honestly, what I want to see women being real leaders of God. And when I envision, Lori, what you say is like, you know, my Relief Society president or her counselors giving someone a blessing and being able to witness that. That for me, that would be a very powerful, faith-affirming experience. You know, that's not a power grab. That's not inappropriate or unrighteous dominion. That's just me wanting to see women exercising the power of God in a way that we generally accept, you know, the power of God being exercised.
Well, particularly if you see having power as having the ability to do good. Right. As having the ability to bless people's lives, you have to start seeing power less in terms of lording over or presiding, and more in terms of ministering.
And I think that like in Ordained Women, that's really how we see that. We want the ability as women and as men who are our allies to be able to share in those ritual moments that are so important to us as Mormons, in those blessings, in baptism, in ordination, in passing the sacrament, and in the temple, and all of these ritual ways that are kind of the bedrock of our Mormon lives.
Yeah.
One thing I've been doing a lot lately is I've been focusing my personal study on studying the priesthood, and particularly what is our current doctrine of the priesthood. Mm-hmm. Where are we at today? And I think there have been some changes in the rhetoric just recently that imply that we are looking at it in a different way today, but it doesn't seem like we have a very clear doctrine of the priesthood. I don't think men would tolerate it if we taught them the priesthood as vaguely as we teach women. Because I've been looking at, for example, we've been talking about Elder Oaks. Elder Oaks says that we exercise the priesthood in the context of our callings. Mm-hmm. We've also had Elder Ballard say that we exercise the priesthood as temple workers in the temple. Mm-hmm. Well, so there are ways that women exercise the priesthood, but we don't talk about it. We work really hard to train men on how to exercise the priesthood.
Right.
But we
teach women
how women can exercise the priesthood.
Right, and I think we go to great lengths to teach women that the priesthood in our manuals is not something that they have, but something that other people do, that men do.
Exactly.
But April, you're absolutely right. The rhetoric, particularly in the last couple of years, is changing dramatically. One of the things that I noticed in particular is that they have just about universally, church leaders have said that men are not the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what's happening is they're unhooking a priesthood from maleness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really an important thing because that priesthood is a power that I interpret that as priesthood is a power that transcends gender.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can start re-envisioning priesthood as less and stop referring to using men and priesthood interchangeably in the church, that's a huge step forward in women being able to envision themselves with power and authority.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another thing that I've been kind of concerned about as I've been reading these current talks is I've noticed that among our female auxiliary leaders, they've been doing a lot of talk about the priesthood, but I haven't read any statement by a female leader saying that women exercise the authority of the priesthood, or even that women exercise the priesthood in the temple. So it seems that even though lately our male leaders are starting to use these words, in practice, our female leaders don't feel like they have that authority. So
I feel like if I were to make a comment about women, exercising the priesthood in my Relief Society meeting on a Sunday, I'm pretty sure that I'd be called in by the bishop as saying something that I shouldn't be saying. And I think, so like while, quorum of the 12 men can say this, we're not yet, like as you say, April, we're just not yet to the stage where we can talk about it. Even our female leaders don't feel that they can openly talk about this.
But they have, even in say Sister Burton's talk at BYU, I think it was during the women's women's meeting.
Yeah.
But even she talks about women having not only the blessings of the priesthood, enjoying not only the blessings of the priesthood, but also I think I'm not sure she uses the word exercise, but she uses the word power, that they have the power of the priesthood. Now, it's not terribly well defined.
Mm-hmm.
So you're left sort of scratching your head, wondering what that means. But, my feeling is, as women who care about the status of women, outside the church as well as inside the church, it seems to me that that we ought to take this and develop it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And for anyone listening, that talk was published in the Ensign for June 2014.
Right. It's the most recent Ensign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really encouraging in many ways.
Right, but she does. power. The word power
power
appears a lot. So you're right, absolutely right, Christy. It's really, I think it's encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It gives me hope.
All right. Well, I think we've gone through all of the discussion questions. Does anyone have any final comments or questions before we close?
Well, next time, actually, we're going to be going more in depth on the issue in the next discussion on sort of the theological underpinnings of women and women's ordination, and we'll be using President Burton's talk and Elder Oakes's talk and any number of scriptures as the basis for our discussion. So it'll be really fun to talk about this in more in depth. I thank you, April, for raising that issue, because I think it's time to explore this, I think, and it would be really a fun discussion to do that.
I'm excited.
Me too.
And April, thank you for all of your work. I mean, the video is terrific.
Thanks.
Yes, it is.
And you certainly have been a major voice for raising the issues of women and priesthood and power, and power in the sense of ministering and empowering others. And I appreciate all of your work, April.
Yeah,
Thank you,
me
Lori.
too. And your podcast that you did with Lindsay Henson Park and Women's History and the supplemental readings was excellent too. Loved it.
Really. Good work, April.
Thanks. Just building on my foremothers, like you.
Oh, and Nadine. Nadine was one of the
Nadine.
first to lay out these.
Yay, Lori and Nadine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, you guys.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you.
everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.